with that, we're going to go ahead and kick off the study session. This is on our comprehensive plan update, and we'll be talking about implementation and metrics today. And for that, we'll just turn it over directly to Ms. Lust.
Perfect. Thank you, Mayor. With me here today, Marty Snell, WSP, our project manager for the comp plan update. So today, scooch that over. Talk about slightly different component of Envision Ridgefield 2045 that we've been working on for the past several months, kind of picking away at it to get you some draft information to review and kind of share our framework for an implementation plan. So that's kind of the goal for this evening, is to share not every detail in it. We've come up with a lot of stuff, but sure to share the framework, share some examples, and importantly get council's feedback on sort of the direction we're heading with this implementation plan. And then at the end of the meeting, we just have some general schedule updates as well, to the extent that we are informed on council for the plan update moving forward. Oh, next slide, please. So kind of how this all started was at the beginning of this comp plan update process, kind of reflecting on the 2016 plan, what was successful, what wasn't, what could be improved upon, what were kind of main goals besides just compliance for this update. And one of those things was to work on an implementation plan. We really identified kind of a lack of meaningful ways to track follow through as a weakness of the 2016 plan, and started thinking about, okay, how can we make something that incentivizes us to pick this plan up off the shelf regularly after it's adopted, and hold ourselves accountable. So that's what we're doing, developing an implementation plan for the comp plan to translate these long-range vision goals and policies into clear and achievable actions. The key question we're trying to get at through all of this is, how does the city actually make this plan happen and achieve specific outcomes that are important to the community? Okay, so we're kind of responsible in a couple ways through these actions. The first is just kind of being accountable to our own plan, ensuring that the updated comp plan is active and actionable, giving ourselves ways to track progress on goals, policies, and metrics, and providing a framework for ongoing updates and refinements. There are also a couple ways, new requirements where we are accountable to provide a Department of Commerce with progress reports at a 5-year kind of midway check-in for the comp plan. Those are required for both affordable housing and greenhouse gas emissions reductions. So this will give us a framework to be able to report back on those specific items. All right, you've probably heard me say in a lot of these study sessions, remember policies, policy level, super high level. We'll get into the details next. So just kind of as a framing example of what we're trying to do here, policy versus implementation. Policies, again, high level decisions, identifying important issues, meeting common goals. They take time, they're big, they're high level, they're sort of these grand aims to meet the needs of the community. Implementation is how those are executed, typically through regulations, standards, and services. Next slide, please. Just example from our own draft plan, something we've heard a lot from council, community, other stakeholders is this idea of preserving downtown small town charm. Translated that into a policy in the draft plan, preserve downtown small town charm with pedestrian scale and ground floor commercial uses, promote special events and inclusive public spaces, and encourage a mix of uses to increase utilization. As an example of how that is translated into a couple implementation items, we've picked out establish a downtown development review process and adopt a new downtown sub-area plan. It's kind of a good example of how some of these implementation items were really starting with a bit of a blank slate and thinking, okay, what could we do? And some of these implementation items are something that we already know we're going to be doing, and then kind of working backwards to match it to a policy. Okay. So the examples we can go through today are a little bit simplified for just the sake of digestion, but in our full draft implementation plan, we are identifying 6 key things, starting with the comp plan policy, then looking at implementation strategies, timeline, metrics to track, potential lead departments and or partners, and then general funding parameters. We're not attempting to get into detail of exactly how much these things are going to cost, but more trying to get a handle on, okay, is this something we could do in existing budget? Is it going to require some sort of budget request? Is it something where we'd really be relying on grant funding or other outside sources, just to get a sense of magnitude? Today we'll focus on the policy implementation strategies and metrics/outcomes, kind of the meat of the matter. All right, any questions so far about why we're doing this, sort of the general framework? Okay, great. Next slide. Oh, some questions to sort of guide our work today on the screen before you, but I'll go ahead and read through them. Does this framework reflect how you expect the comp plan to be implemented in practice? Would organizing actions in an implementation matrix in this structure be helpful for decision making and tracking progress over time? Which strategies or actions feel most important to focus on first? Are there any priorities that rise to the top? Understanding that the information presented today is not exhaustive. We have, as you know, so many draft policies, and we're not going to show you like all 5 implementation ideas we came up with for each of them. But understanding that, is there any major topic or consideration that is missing here? Basically, do you have any ideas that you think we absolutely need to look at as we go through these things? Okay. All right, so for the presentation, we've kind of split out into the comp plan elements and just given a few examples for each. So I think, you know, the easiest thing is probably just to chunk these out into land use, housing, economic development, and use these examples as a means to kind of start a conversation about what types of implementation items council thinks are important for some of these topics. Not going to read every word on the slide. You're welcome, but on the slide before you are a couple what we think are pretty core land use policies around establishing land supplies and densities and supporting targeted expansion of the UGA following council's preferred land use alternative, and then just examples of how we would structure like cutting into the next level of specificity, which is the implementing strategies, and then more detail after that would be like metrics to track to try and make sure these policies are actioned, basically. Call. Maybe let you take a moment to digest and see if there are any questions or comments on land use. Yeah.
Middle housing. How do we work with? Excuse me. Just a question on middle housing. How do we work with developers to encourage them to do middle housing? And am I correct? Middle housing would be duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes?
You're correct. Middle housing, duplex, triplex, fourplex, depending on your definition, townhouses, cottage housing clusters, ADUs, kind of anything in that land between single-family detached and apartment buildings. And a very good question about working with developers. This is one of many areas where we kind of have carrot and stick options. Our code is one of our biggest tools. How we write it is important here. I think it's there's encourage. You can require. I think there's a lot of legislation a couple years ago about, for larger cities, requiring middle housing. We're under those thresholds, but as part of looking ahead too. Sorry.
Well, just to be clear, the requirement to provide missing middle is a requirement on cities. It's not actually a requirement on developers. So a developer isn't required to build anything because they're a private developer. You can't force them to build anything. It's a requirement on cities to allow that development and create codes that are more amenable to providing that sort of housing type. But that is that's the crux of the issue that we deal with, is that Director Luss is 1,000% correct that we have these code opportunities before us in how we can make it easier to do that work and provide places for where that can occur. But at the end of the day, the private market determines whether it gets built and whether it gets lived in.
I was just going to say too on that, it feels more like a marketability factor, right? Like we can adjust the code, but if we adjust the code and it's not marketable, they're not going to build it. So maybe the metric would be a little bit more specific to that, where we'd say increase middle housing and high density housing developments over time through it. But I don't know, adding some language in there that says, should this be, is there a market factor in there that we need to consider as well, so that it actually gets done? Because if we set the policy and it never gets done, then I feel like we failed because we haven't created something that developers can work with.
It feels to me like the only way that we could accomplish something like that is if the city, somehow funded some of the property or something. I mean, the developer, when they buy the property, they pretty much have to create a house, build a house that's a certain price, right, for the funding. I mean, I don't know if anybody that's doing this, but I mean, if the city had a way to fund some of the property so that the developers didn't pay so much for it, they got some kind of a discounted price, and they could build, if they were going to build low-income or middle housing. I don't know how that would work, but.
Well, yeah, and Councilor Favela is whispering land trust in my ear, and that's something we've talked about before too. I think that's something that could certainly be considered. I think on top of that, it's also I think what we haven't seen, and staff, I'd love some input on this as well, but what we haven't seen is a lot of middle housing, specifically in Ridgefield, only because it hasn't penciled for a lot of builders. And when you look at things like permits and fees, like impact fees and the permitting process and everything like that, and goes so high, when you start like entry-level housing or middle housing, then that almost makes it untenable. So I almost wonder if we need to find incentives in there without also giving away the farm on our end, because I think there's some that's really necessary. But how do we find the balance there that incentivizes them to build middle housing and make it pencil for them, so we actually provide that?
So in our situation, due to our population, we are not required at this point to have middle housing?
There's a specific middle housing bill that we're not yet required to comply with because we're under 20,000, I believe is the number in population still. But we'll reach that number during this planning horizon, unless something like really weird happens. So I think that's kind of the thought here, is preparing ourselves for when we do need to meet that. We have a lot of provisions in our code already that are meeting that. They're just not necessarily, to your point, used.
Right.
Well, I think one of the things that we're looking to do with this and the kind of the implementation strategy on this is to prove up, to say that here are all the measures that have been taken by council to lay the foundations for missing middle housing. Are they working or not? Because not only internally and locally is that important, but it's important at a statewide level, because you have legislators from all over the state who are throwing all kinds of requirements onto local governments with the expectation that it is going to promote and provide the housing that they seek. We don't know that that's true.
Yeah.
And certainly the experience that we've seen in a variety of different areas around the state has not shown that to be true. So At some point, we're going to need to go back to the state and show them and say, all right, are your methods that you would like us to use, are they working? Or are we going to need to look at more drastic measures such as, somehow addressing the price of the land, or creating land trusts, or whatever those things may be that actually have funding associated with them versus kind of requirements.
Sorry, I feel like a lot of that, though, like we talk about land trust, and I love the idea, for a small city to implement a land trust program or something along those lines, or create those levels of incentives. I think that we tap out really quickly on what we can do, and it almost becomes a state problem. I even think about, this is really fresh because I sat at a luncheon today and I listened to the Lieutenant Governor rail on cities for not doing enough to provide entry-level and middle housing. And I kind of take exception to that because of our city, where we're doing everything we can, but at the same time, I realize as a small city, there's only so much you can do to provide for that. And I think that there are certain parts where we got to look at the state and say, this is also your problem. I don't know if we fold that into metrics or not, if that's something we need to do, but we just focus on the limited things that we can do. But real solutions, I think, are going to kind of happen at both levels, right?
Yeah, I think that it could be an interesting angle to look at our metrics through, is what metrics even make sense for a small city to track, and that is helpful for us and also could be helpful feedback for the state as we go through this sort of brand new affordable housing report back exercise in 5 years.
Yeah.
All right, I don't necessarily want to linger in anything too long, so I can go ahead and move ahead if that's okay.
We can move forward, yeah.
All right, the next slide just has, this is the example I already gave earlier, but I figured this group might have some thoughts and ideas on important things for us to be tracking for downtown land use planning. So if there are any of those thoughts at this point, please go ahead and share. We have a couple ideas in the box.
Regarding downtown, have we as a council made any decision at all regarding the 3 lots that we currently own on Main Street?
No, the council, in the conversations we've had with council, the decision was made to hold off on any redevelopment ideas for those parcels that are publicly owned until there's a sub-area plan in place that's been updated, that's had community input, that really has a community vision for what you want to see in the downtown. And then you'll have a better sense of what makes the most sense. And then we can go to work with the private property owner that's adjacent to us and start working on a redevelopment process.
Did we ever talk about design code for downtown, specifically for the empty lots? If someone wants to build something new, that it has a very niche design code to make sure that small town charm, it kind of flows with the rest of everything, so you're not, you know what I'm saying, coming into town and then there's a brand new modern home amongst all of the rest of some of the older buildings.
Yeah, we're working on a scope of work for the downtown sub-area plan update. That's definitely, inevitably, design's going to be a big chunk of that work. But also something we can look at for this planning document to include as well.
Just a comment. Have we thought at all about when the port develops their area downtown, some kind of connectivity between downtown and the waterfront?
We have, certainly, and this is long-standing. There, for many, many years, before any of us were involved, there were plans to create the Pioneer Street overpass to get rid of the grade separated crossings at Mill and Division. That work was successful, and in doing so, it created a safer crossing where you don't have the interactions with the trains, you don't have the train whistles, you have a better opportunity for the waterfront. That said, during that process of building the overpass, the right-of-way at Division was maintained by the city and is still publicly owned by the city, which is something that we had to fight a lot for a number of years with BNSF over. But that is currently a private crossing, and we've done pre-design through a federal lands access program grant to look at a multimodal crossing at Division that would go over the rail and connect the northern pieces of the downtown with the waterfront more easily. It wouldn't be a vehicular crossing, other than the emergency vehicles would still be able to use that right of way if necessary. God forbid the overpass was not available. So yes, there has been conversation about that.
Thank you.
Of course.
Just one question, just on the implementing strategy. So adopt a new downtown sub-area plan by summer 2027. Is that, I'm assuming that's actual, right? It's probably realistically that far out?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. Is there a way to make that happen sooner?
Probably depends on the full scope of work, but
Yeah,
yeah,
okay.
yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I know we're talking about it's there right now, and I just want to call attention to that as well. So
Certainly.
Yeah.
I think we're being conservative with that,
okay.
but yeah, something we can talk about for
Right.
sure.
I just got a comment on that crossing on Division. Is that multimodal? Will it be for bicycles, walkers, and I can't think of the
Golf carts?
golf
Four-wheelers?
carts. Yeah, I was gonna
Yes.
say go-karts.
Yes.
But at golf
Hopefully-
carts.
I mean, I don't know about go-karts, but yeah.
Yeah, okay.
So the next element where we pulled some examples just to talk around is the housing element. And I know we covered a bit about missing middle and the land use lens already, as we've said over and over. There's certainly a lot of overlap between these elements. But yeah, again, just to think about, like, in terms of housing policy, what types of strategies make sense, and what kind of things do we want to track? And sort of a follow-up question on this one is, if you look at the metrics column, we have an item that's talking about it in like increased numbers of ADUs, and then we have another item where we've come up with a number to achieve by a certain year. And we definitely appreciate feedback from council on sort of like how we want to frame some of these metrics. If we want to keep them more broad, like increase certain housing products, or if we do want to be a bit more bold and specific and actually create goals for things like number of units.
I'm curious on this one, how much of this is contingent on our alternatives being accepted. So we're currently pushing alternative 2 with the county council. If they end up going with, say, alternative 1, I think that sort of changes how we approach this, right? So like, it doesn't really feel like we can encourage a mix of housing types under that, because we'd be forced into a lot more multifamily or higher density housing with that, versus getting our expansion areas and being able to provide kind of a broader mix of housing.
Yeah, so I do think what our plan looks like depends a lot on what the county selects in terms of their preferred alternative. I think whatever they land on, we are responsible to those requirements from the state to create capacity for housing at different income bands. I don't think that changes for us. The map for how it happens might just look different.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
Yeah.
But if it makes sense for us to kind of hold off on some of these until we know for sure what the county selects, I think we have time to do that as well.
I don't think I'm comfortable like putting a specific number in this plan. More like a goal or a percentage-ish, but not a specific number. I feel like that locks us in. And then for, simple math, I've never been good at math, y'all. But for the 25% increase, when we have, let's say, 2 new apartment complexes come in, how is the 25% captured? Because if we have 2 new apartment complexes come in and each have 10% allocated to low income, is that now 20% or is it 25% of the total new development coming in by 2030?
Depend on how we wrote it, I think.
Oh,
yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Well, who established the 25% for middle income and by 2030? Is that a state, us, or just an estimate?
For that number, that's just kind of a draft we're giving y'all to react to. That's not a specific requirement coming from the state or anything.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I guess when I look at the A under implementing strategies, I can't even imagine putting 2 ADUs on a residential lot. Does that mean in addition to the primary house?
So that was a required code update that we've actually already done just recently, allowing 2 per with development standards that, you still have to meet setbacks and impervious surface. So.
As long as the HOA allows it, right? Or do we override the HOAs?
They're just separate regulations. Oh.
And this is another one where, and we can work on this a little bit, where I think there's value in us tracking the reality versus the code. Because we do have a lot of allowances for this to occur, but like you just indicated, Mayor Pro Tem, there are HOAs that have restrictions on what you can build or redevelop. There are some, and the regulations change over time. The state can certainly address that if they so choose with HOAs, but they haven't to a large extent. So the reality of what we will see in Ridgefield for how much we'll redevelop with those may be different than what is allowed and what a general expectation may be. So again, that's something that we might want to and be able to track for you to see what have we actually seen based on what we put forward as options.
Well, and when you get, I don't know what the number of lots per acre would be that would actually stop that from happening, but the amount of lots that we have per, you know what I mean? It's like probably not room for maybe even one ADU in some of them, and certainly not for 2. So yeah.
And that is the other piece of it, right? Is what are the setbacks? What are the environmental constraints? Mm-hmm. What's already on the property? Mm-hmm. And so there are definitely a lot of complexities.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. I had a conversation with the county treasurer today, and one of the things they were talking about is the income in 98642. And so 98642 has a fairly high income. So is that going to reflect, like Mr. Burkle had asked, does that reflect on medium income or low density, the price of that? Is it statewide? I'm piggybacking on top of you, Mr. Burkle. How is that matrix put together?
For the income strata, is it countywide income strata, or is it it's not by jurisdiction?
No, it's not by jurisdiction. It's based on the area median income, which is countywide.
Countywide.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay.
I want to just go back to something that Councilor Pavella said and just follow up with you on that. So when you said you're not comfortable putting numbers on, are you referring to, say, for example, the goal of 900 affordable housing units by 2035, something like that? Okay. I think metrics are something that we should attach numbers to whenever possible, but I want to make sure that they're based in something that are attainable, so maybe just checking to make sure, is the 25% increase in middle housing and the 900 affordable housing units by 2035 is, just double check to make sure that is attainable. Are we, what I don't want to do is end up 10 years from now doing our next comp plan update and have the county tell us that we're not hitting our targets when we've sort of been handcuffed by it. So, but if we can show it, say, hey, we set this goal, here's the policy, here's the goal, here's the metric, and then we did hit it, then I think that makes a compelling case for whatever's in the future.
Just looking at that number, that'd be 90 affordable housing units a year between now and 2035, if I'm correct. That seems rather substantial.
But that would also include apartments, right? Yeah.
If they're affordable. I don't think apartments are necessarily affordable either. Yeah. Any other thoughts on this one? Okay.
Thank you. That's helpful for us. Next element we just want to chat about again. What do metrics and tracking look like is a bit of a different one. Public facilities. This one, of course, we also have our capital facilities plans, but it's also a comp plan element. So we want to make sure we sort of tie those things together with some tracking mechanisms that can be as simple as, working with our public works and infrastructure staff to set timelines for CFP updates, and can also be more specific, like looking at stormwater management goals that our stormwater team's working on, and working with them to create some goals and metrics there too. And how these are just a few examples, but public facilities can be a pretty broad definition. Are we also needing to think about city buildings and what are trackable goals around that type of facility in the future, in addition to the sort of comp plan definition of facilities, which is water and stormwater type stuff.
I'm glad we brought this one up because this is something that I was thinking about last night when we talk about bringing density in and adding capacity. Do we, in our building of capacity and utilities, have the water to withhold these projects in the future? Because that is a really important topic that we speak about often, is water, and do we have two competing factors here?
I think it's, definitely a really key thing to be tracking in its relationship to development. The water CFP, which was updated in 2024, relied on these same housing and jobs allocations. So there's shared numbers between the two.
Again, I got a comment. I had a conversation today about the big stormwater pond being put in at the fairgrounds, really deep. That what they're doing, they're going to do there is put in milk crates and fill that with milk crates and pave over the top of it. And that'll be the stormwater retention area. Hear this, Ryan? No. Retention area, and it'll absorb the flow for a while and then meter it out. But they can still use the land over the top of it. You can't build buildings on it, but you can build roads or parking lots or whatever, and it's a lot cheaper than the big culverts like they put in out at the RV park by Papa Pete's. They put them big culverts in the ground, but this is a lot cheaper and simpler, and then you can drive on it. Okay, just a comment.
So that's a stormwater pond that's being built. I
Yeah.
wondered if it was a swimming pool or what.
Yeah, stormwater pond, it'll be paved over.
Okay.
Yeah, I think the public facilities strategies and metrics are interesting and a bit unique in that we have these separate planning documents for each type of public facility. So that's kind of on us as staff to make sure we're not doing anything in here that's duplicating work or sending things in a direction that's not specified by those other plans. So, but yeah, appreciate the thoughts on priorities for these two. Oh, thank you.
One more on 311, the schools. What does that mean for us in terms of building out and our impact with schools? Because there really is no crossover with the city. We don't really do anything with the schools. We don't fund schools. So what are we looking at there, and what is that really referring to, for clarity?
It's a good question, and potentially an edit to the policy language. Might be what I'm hearing too. Yeah.
I mean, I do think it's important, even when we talk about building up downtown and the increased traffic. I mean, it's mindful to remind ourselves that we have an elementary school right here with a ton of small children, and we need the safe routes to school. So how are we balancing what we're doing, but also honoring the very community that we're trying to protect and maintain with our littles?
Okay, I just had another comment on impervious surfaces, like when you put the stepping stones in or in a parking lot. Our soils here don't allow for water to infiltrate. It usually runs off because of the clay. But a lot of the parking lots where they do have infiltration, the cracks usually fill up with dust, dirt, and then they don't function anymore. They have to come in and pressure wash them. There's a lot of maintenance on them to trying to keep them so that they do the job that they're doing. Are supposed to do, I should say.
Okay. I think the next slide was just another public facilities example, but we can probably skip by it and talk about economic development. The two examples we pulled out here, kind of the two of the pillars of economic development strategy we've been talking about throughout this process, one being, of course, downtown, and the other being those larger employment site opportunities out by the junction. So figured we could have a bit of a conversation around those two kind of economic development pillars, and again, is how we're framing the metrics. Does it make sense? Do you have different ideas for items to track and how to track them for our economic development planning?
So this looks specific to downtown and the waterfront as far as economic development policies. Do we need to consider? I would think we do need to consider. I'm just wondering if it's appropriate to consider it here to include other areas as well, like commercial neighborhood business zones, and then regional zones too. And I call about the CNB because I think a lot of those, what I've been hearing recently is a lot of those feel like they're not, there's either downtown or it's the junction, and the in between feels like it gets a little bit lost in the mix sometimes. And so there need to be an economic development factor that includes all types of commercial zones that we designate, not just the downtown sub area.
Yeah, so these examples, one's downtown and one's junction, really. Yeah. And again, these are two of many economic development draft policies that Council's previously reviewed. So we can go back in and make sure we have more meat on the bones around some of those other areas as well. To the goals of this study session for those, I guess, sort of middle commercial areas, what would be important to be tracking over time in terms of their success?
Well, I think retention's a big factor for those as well. I don't know, I struggle with this one because I've talked a lot about the need to recruit. I don't know if that's necessarily our position. I kind of place that more on our chambers and our Main Street programs, that, you know, the business-centric organizations, but having some type of business retention, and also knowing that, like at NCNBs, those are also smaller businesses. And so I know we've done a lot of work where we've kind of deferred payments on impact fees and things like that, but just making, you know, continuing to evaluate how do we create more business-friendly policies, especially geared towards small businesses, because that is an economic development factor, no matter what part of the city they're in.
Well, this may be really far out. Would there be any consideration or potential that we could create a situation where council members, maybe on a monthly business, went out and met with our business people? Just find out what's going on, how we doing, what can we help you with? I don't know. What do you think?
That is actually a process that existed for quite some time here in Ridgefield. Yeah, we did that for quite a while. It was something that was patterned after something that Vancouver did back when Royce Pollard was mayor and Pat McDonnell was the city manager. At the time, Mayor Onslow asked that we set up meetings on a regular basis, and it would be for him and myself, and then we would take a council member with. We did that for a number of years. I'll be honest with you, when COVID hit, obviously that stopped, and since we got back from COVID, it really isn't we tried to get it going again. It wasn't something that really got traction with some of the businesses, but it's absolutely something we can look at doing.
Thank you.
Of course.
Fits into the framework well too. There's your implementation strategy is, you know, council member meetings with the local business community, and we can track how often, what you talked about, what you see as benefits of that. So I think that's a really good idea.
I think it'd be good also, just from a metric standpoint, if we're talking about those areas, downtown specifically, and as that relates to RISE, looking at something that says, like, are we going to be able to measure, are there like new brick and mortar or new businesses? Like, I don't know what the percentage is, and I'd be arbitrary to suggest something, 25% more business activity in the downtown sub area or something like that. But some type of metric around that shows that, are we attracting new businesses, and is this a viable place to come and do business in the heart of the city, not just near the junction?
My personal opinion, currently, I don't think we have the available space in downtown to attract many new businesses. That's why I think it's important that open property on Main Street be made available and out there as quickly as possible to do just that.
It was really interesting. I read the report on the new businesses coming into Ridgefield, and I went through and I calculated that it was like 38 new businesses or business license in March. 30 of them were at-home businesses. Yeah. So it was really kind of.
That was a very interesting report.
So I know these are just samples, but that brings up an interesting point, because we've talked about that. We've talked about the remote, like leaning into the remote work economy, and does there need to be some sort of metric around that we said, like, how do we know that we've been successful in that? We did sort of a casual survey at one point. We got some preliminary data, but maybe it's another survey and say, how do we measure against that? Are we increasing the number of remote, the viability of working remote here? And I don't know what that looks like. You know, I think that's a bigger discussion, but adding some sort of metric around that.
We can come up with some ideas.
Yeah.
Sorry, I just had a big thought, and I'm going to think out loud. If we take the policy moving in the direction, work from home, everybody works, it feels like most people work from home. There are so many businesses ran out of the home. How does that impact new businesses coming into Ridgefield and housing? Because if we're accommodating, we need X amount of jobs. Well, the jobs are coming in, but we don't necessarily need more housing for those jobs because they're already in existing homes already here. So is there a way to cross over that or have that accounted for in our numbers with where we're at in this world of working from home and telecommute?
well, if I'm correct, we don't actually count remote workers as new jobs, do we? Or, I thought there was something along there that we said, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the way that the county calculates it, they calculate as far as jobs basis, they approximate about 4% of all jobs are remote work. I think is 4% is what are work from home. So they do give a small percentage, but not the actual percentage that we see. And when you're calculating jobs, if you work for HP in Vancouver, but you are a remote work and you don't go into the office, it counts as a Vancouver job, even though the person, the income, the time, the energy is all spent in Ridgefield. So there is a discrepancy in how things are calculated and how they're reported, for sure.
Is that largely out of our hands, and that becomes a policy that goes beyond the city level, right?
It does, but as far as how tracking, if providing opportunity for remote work and understanding how we exist within that environment and how we can support it,
Yeah.
and then tracking our success in it is something that council wants to do, that's absolutely within your control.
Yeah. I'm for that.
And it might impact, land use policies and what's important to track for those as well. For example, transportation. Yeah.
I would rather track it and have it and not need it, you know what I mean, than to need it and not have it later on. This data that could possibly be really beneficial in the future, that we can show, how many businesses are coming in, but they're based here in Ridgefield only versus working somewhere else and telecommuting here in Ridgefield.
Great, thanks. Yeah, we'll make sure as we're refining this that we have a good amount of action items around that work from home data collection and then future action as well. So, cool. Okay. Everybody's favorite, Parks and Rec. Again, this is another one where they have their own planning documents, but it's also required as part of the comp plan. Largely we're referencing those other documents in this work, but working with our park staff to make sure we're tracking things that make sense to them. But again, just some examples around siting, equity, and interconnection within the city, which are all themes that we've heard from the public throughout this process and seem like germane things to find ways to track them. Also kind of goes back to the question of what kind of things does it make sense to assign specific numbers to, versus potentially coming up with other ways of creating a metric to track, which I know is a tough question, but.
Looking at the 6.2.1 and then just the implementing strategies. So we talk about ensure all schools and parks are connected by trails and pathways within a half-mile radius. That's talking about schools and parks being connected. Does that speak to a larger effort to connect all trails in the city? And do we have that someplace or specified?
I believe so, yeah.
Okay. And then the other one I would touch on is just the metrics for 6.1.4 is construct at least 2 new neighborhood parks or green spaces. I'm all about that. I want to continue making sure I don't think our 25% parks and open spaces policy is going away anytime soon, but we also have a backlog of parks that need to be finished. And so I don't know if that's grouped within that, or we say, do we finish the parks already in the pipeline and then 2 new parks per neighborhood or something like that, or whatever that looks like. But definitely touching on making sure that the parks in the pipeline are prioritized before we start adding new ones.
Yeah, and that can be a metric in and of itself,
Yeah.
too.
Yeah, exactly.
A resident approached me this last week about, a second resident approached me about the bike, if there was a bike lane, along Pioneer to be able to go out to Ridgefield Junction. And so I again explained that was, the sidewalk was for both, and he was just adamant that was not how he would ride a bike. He would not ride a bike on a sidewalk that people were walking on. It was just too dangerous and all this kind of stuff. And I'm like, interesting. I mean, that's the first person that's actually, responded to that. But I don't know if there's bikers that feel like, other bikers that feel like that, or what the general census is, but.
It's certainly something we can do a little more digging on. It is a methodology that has been used more because it gets the bicyclists away from the motorized traffic, so it's safer for the bicyclists by a lot to get them out of the lanes of travel. And by creating that double wide, not just 5 foot width, but 10 feet on both sides of Pioneer, you're actually creating a safer thoroughfare. But it is different, and so it makes perfect sense that people would be unnerved by that if it is different, and it's different even within the system itself. So we can do some more work and digging and find out more about kind of perceptions and what we can do to help with that.
Is that stuff, Steve, that often is sort of repeated periodically in the community survey? People's
It's a good question.
impressions, perceptions of the experience of like using trails in Ridgefield or using bike lanes in Ridgefield. I'm just spitballing here, but I'm thinking that's an existing sort of resource we have and could track the results. And then,
we can definitely look at that. Yeah, we can absolutely look at that and see if there's information in the community survey that we do every 3 or 4 years that we can use to track that, whether it's perceptions or reality of people's, how safe they feel on that. And there is a whole new metric that some jurisdictions are using now, and it is a how I feel metric. And it is literally like if I'm on a trail or on a bike path or on a road, how safe do I feel? And they actually have a rating scale associated with that, just because the perception is the reality to a large extent. So.
And I think the bikers are definitely safer being off the road, but his concern was that people that are walking aren't necessarily safer because he said.
And thus the 10 feet as opposed to 5.
It's like, I'm not looking for people that are walking or whatever, you know what I mean? So it's just, I understood where he was coming from, but I just didn't know if anybody else had brought that up.
Not yet, but we can definitely look into that.
Just to comment on ADA compliant, are we only needing to be compliant within the confines of the park? Or do we also need to be concerned about ADA compliance on the trails?
so I know our park staff could speak to this much more eloquently, but I know as part of the engineering standards update that incorporated standards for parks and trails, it really depends on the type of trail, because there are some that just can't. And there's some that absolutely can and should, and I think that's driven by their location and what they're accessing. So do you think it's a mix?
Is that like is there like a trail designation? Like I just think of like skiing like a black diamond trail.
Basically, yeah.
Like okay.
Yeah, there are different trail types that are.
Say, these ones are going to be accessible because they're classified as this or something.
Exactly. Yeah.
Not a bad idea.
Oh yeah, I think I'm repeating what I just heard. I was in my own thought though, but when we do the trail mapping, having parks include that in there, highlighting what trails are ADA accessible and which ones are not, so people have that awareness when they're mapping out their trail or they want to, go out for the day, they know what route to take, which one would be accessible for them.
Even going a step further possibly would be signing that would indicate beyond this point it's not ADA compliant or whatever would be appropriate?
I feel like we had that conversation in a council meeting before a long time ago, but it would be worth, bringing that back up.
Move on. We have, I think, 2 more subject areas with some examples to talk around. One is our climate element. Again, this is a newly required element, this update cycle, and kind of has a lot of overlap with every other element, basically. But as a standalone, it focuses on greenhouse gas reduction and climate resilience. And this is one of the 2 elements where we do have now requirements to be reporting back in 5 years to the state on how we are doing. So definitely want to think about what is realistic for us to track to kind of show our work on that. Again, these are just examples.
Right. I think, as an example, 7.4.3 feels like it could probably use a little bit more substance. It feels really broad right now, to say, and Councilor Davis actually highlighted that in his email in prep for this, but he's, like, how do you monitor and report the conversion of grass lawns into native gardens, things like that. Because you don't want to be certainly known as the kind of city that's going out there and like checking lawns and measuring lawns. I've lived in that kind of town, and it doesn't go over well. So something that gives more substance there, like what does that metric actually look like rather than just like monitoring and reporting? And is that really the best way to go, or is it more of like an encouragement? We encourage people to do these types of things.
I think there too, you'll run into situations with HOAs that require grass as opposed to artificial turf or a native-looking front yard.
There's a very real example in the city.
Yeah, definitely.
I think it was, I can't recall what city in Arizona or California worked with all of the citizens to convert yards away from need of irrigation, and there were credits given, and I can't remember the city for sure, but it worked. You drive in it now, there's no grass. Palm Springs.
All right, we'll skip ahead to transportation. Okay, I have a lot of words on this one, so it's split into two slides for two example policies. But transportation is one where definitely had some ideas for both tracking and like programs as metrics. If you go to the next slide, Julie, I think be interesting to talk around like using that level of service as a metric for transportation and as a means of assessing networks for different users. Or other ideas for what about transportation is going to be important for us to keep track of over the next several years.
Just for transportation in general, and as you look at this, I don't know if it fit within like 814 here, but our year-long discussions about C-Tran and board composition and funding and all of that kind of begs the question of like what should public transportation look like within Ridgefield? That we have one route right now. Do we need to look at some alternatives to just standardized, conventional public transportation, which is a bus, and we've talked about a rubber tire trolley, we've talked about, just different things, but I think it's worth capturing somewhere along here where, it feels pretty abstract now, but something to the effect of, do we want to look at what alternative transportation, public transit methods look like inside a city like Ridgefield? And I don't know really where to go beyond that other than just to put it out there.
Looking at public transportation, I've observed the bus that we have that comes into Ridgefield. Rarely do you see more than one or two persons on that bus. I don't know whether it's just going to take a matter of time before people decide I should ride the bus, but currently I'm absolutely taken back by how few people use it, and where do they use it? Where do they go on it?
Well, I'm more curious on like, are they not using it because it's not practical for them in a city like Ridgefield?
Well, that's definitely something we should look at.
Yeah, or is there a public education piece, or do we need to look at their other options? But
if ridership levels or percentages are something that you would want to track kind of to show whether multimodal access and usage is successful over time. It's certainly something that, I mean, it's an easy metric to get because C-Tran tracks it for each route. So it is something that we could look at.
I'd be very interested in knowing what the ridership is on the loop that comes into Ridgefield. Now, that's not to say that in 5 years, there couldn't be a huge number of people using it. But right now, I'm surprised, yeah.
Well, and that's the point of tracking these, right? Is that this is a 20-year plan that you're putting forward, and it will change over time, just as our community has obviously changed over the past 20-year comp plan timeframe. So it is something that we can track and see how has it changed over time or not, so that you can make amendments, adjustments along the way. I'd be reticent to I'd be deficient in not mentioning the level of traffic stress. That's the metric that I was mentioning, and I couldn't remember the actual metric, is that level of traffic stress. That is this kind of newish metric that's used on the transportation side for driving, but also for those who are not in a motorized vehicle, and it's something we can look at for bicyclists or pedestrians or otherwise.
One thing we might keep track of is when we get to 219th Street over to Hillhurst, what the reduction is on Pioneer Street, and what kind of impact that will be in that period. I hope that in the next 10 years we have that road in, but it will actually, I think, make a big, keep track of that also. And also C-Tran. C-Tran runs a special bus like to gummy bears, not a bus. They bring worker bees in and at the morning shift. They have a dedicated bus that picks up somewhere and comes there. I've seen them go in there and dump people off or take them home in the evenings, maybe to another park and ride or whatever, but they do accommodate them that way.
Yeah, I think transportation is a field where there is a lot of data available to collect. So it's kind of fun to think about, okay, if we collected this data, what goal would that be supporting?
Totally.
Yeah.
Just going back real quick to Mayor Pro Tem's comment about the bicycles on the sidewalk. When we were visiting San Antonio and they had multimodal sidewalks, they actually striped the sidewalks like the road to keep that guide between the bikes and the pedestrians. And I wonder, what does that look like for us if that becomes something? We have the wide sidewalks and pedestrians and bikes, that maybe we're striping those and help people stay in their lane.
Because of exactly that.
Make anybody that rides a bike on the sidewalk use a clothespin and a card. You can hear them coming. In the old days. No.
Hear them coming. Yeah, I think we're going to,
All right.
I mean, obviously
Yeah.
a lot more meat on this bone, but we can keep going here, so.
No, it's that was the last policy language I had. So great. Yeah, it's good to hear. I mean, any chance we have to talk in this group about the comp plan is always helpful for us, just to think about how we frame some of these things and what's important to you all that we focus on. So thank you. This is just a repeat of some of those guiding questions we had. So we can move on to some general schedule updates. We've been working with Clark County staff on figuring out more about what transfer of development rights looks like, including the potential interlocal agreement as it relates to the ag designation process. The sort of next milestone with the county is their council will be holding public hearings on April 27th and 28th regarding their preferred land use alternative. So really, really key date there. I don't know if they'll make a decision on those days. That would be great, because then we would know a lot more about what we need to do next. So cross your fingers for that. I think we'll have a presentation during next week's council meeting, sort of to just, talk about that a little more in a public forum, kind of prep going into it a bit. And I believe, Steve, that Mr. Toyer will be doing kind of a TDR refresher as well during that presentation. And then for our study sessions, moving on to the next slide, we have a few more scheduled out. April 30th, we're going to be talking about critical areas and the environment element, which is something we haven't really touched on yet, but we're making really good progress on updates to the critical areas ordinance, which tie directly to the goals and policies of that environment element. A lot of those goals and policies from the 2016 plan, in my opinion, are still very valid, but there are some that, you know, in the course of doing this code update, we're looking at and thinking, maybe that's one we need to talk about with council. So that'll come before you in a couple weeks. And then there are a couple sort of small elements in our existing plan that we just want to talk through and see if they're still good, see if anything needs to be shifted, both annexation and then public participation. So we have some ideas for those that we'll bring to you for conversation in May. And I think at that point, we will have study sessioned all of our elements. Of course, some of them we talked about so long ago, it might be beneficial to, I don't know, touch base again. That's something we're still working through, is how to do that in a productive way where we're just not repeating it all again, but giving you enough time with these topics before we're starting to bring things through hearings and asking for decisions to be made. So stay tuned. That's all I have. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Anything else from council on this today? Okay. Hearing none, we'll go ahead and conclude the study session. Thank you, everybody.